Kentucky, early spring, 1991. The creek behind the old Tanner place was already out of its banks. Brown water pushed slow through the bottomland, curling around fence posts, swallowing the low corners of a field nobody had managed to farm right in a decade. Elias Reed stood on the county road above it, one boot on the guardrail, watching the water move the way he'd watched it move for 20 years. He wasn't a farmer, not yet. For more than 2 decades he'd worked county road crews, clearing culverts, grading shoulders, learning the hard way what happens when a road is built without understanding where the water wants to go. He'd watched ditches fail. He'd watched springs open up in places no map ever marked. He'd watched good roads wash out because some engineer, years before, had figured all ground was the same ground. Elias was 46, divorced, living plain in a rented house with a leaking porch roof, saving what little he could. He wasn't rich, he wasn't young, but he had 2 things most men driving past that flooded field didn't have. He had a battered field notebook, its cover soft from years, in his back pocket. And he had an old yellow surveyor's level he'd bought secondhand from a retiring crew chief, the kind of tool nobody thought to bring to a land auction. The banker at First Union had a name for the property, a pond that occasionally dries out. He said it with a laugh, the kind of laugh men use when they've already decided something is worthless. 67 acres, bottomland along Rocky Fork Creek, flooded most springs. 2 families had tried to farm it in the last 15 years. Both had lost corn to standing water. Both had lost equipment to mud so deep it swallowed a tractor tire to the axle. Both had walked away calling it cursed ground. Elias called it the only ground he could afford. He signed the papers on a gray Tuesday in March, with rain still dripping off the courthouse eaves. His ex-wife's cousin told him he'd lost his mind. His old road foreman told him bottomland, like that was a grave for a man's savings. Elias didn't argue. He just went out to the property with his level and his notebook, and he started walking. For 3 straight weekends, he walked the 67 acres in rubber boots, sinking to his ankles in places, sure-footed in others. He set stakes. He took readings. He wrote numbers in that notebook, not guesses, numbers, elevation changes measured in inches, not feet, and slowly a pattern started to show itself. There was a line, a subtle rise, barely higher than the ground around it, running diagonally across the northern half of the farm. You couldn't see it standing in the field. You could only see it with a level, sighting across long distances, the way Elias had sighted across county roads for 20 years. An old natural levee, built by the creek itself, over centuries of floods, laying down just enough sediment in one place to create a spine of slightly higher ground. Nobody had ever noticed it, because nobody had ever measured it. Elias sat on that ridge one evening in April, mud drying on his knees, and looked at the property with new eyes. It wasn't 67 acres of bad ground. It was 3 different farms hiding inside one deed, high ground that drained fast, along that levee, a wide transition band that stayed moist most of the season, slow to dry, slow to flood, and true floodplain, low and wet, the kind of ground that would hold water into June some years. Everyone before him had tried to farm all 3 as if they were one field. That, Elias wrote in his notebook, was the mistake. He didn't get it right away, though. Understanding the land and knowing how to work, it turned out to be 2 very different things. That first spring, feeling the pressure to make the farm pay, Elias planted more conventional row crop on the high ground than the season could forgive. Rain came late and heavy. Planting got pushed back 3 weeks. By the time he got seed in the ground, the window for a full-season corn crop had already closed halfway. Part of that first crop never caught up. He also misjudged the transition band, sure it would firm up by early May the way the high ground did. It didn't. He drove a borrowed tractor out onto ground that looked dry on top and was soup 6 inches down. It sank to the frame. It took a neighbor's winch, 2 chains, and the better part of a Saturday, plus $40. Elias didn't love spending to pull it free. He stood in the mud afterward, soaked to the waist, and admitted something to himself. Knowing where the water went wasn't the same as knowing how to farm around it. That was the lesson of year 1. Year 2, Elias stopped fighting the water and started designing around it. On the high ground, the old levee spine, he put in young fruit and nut trees, apple, and a stand of black walnut along the ridge, trees that wanted good drainage and could take a few dry weeks without complaint. On the transition band, he seeded it down to mixed forage grasses and began rotational grazing with a small herd of cattle he bought cheap and healthy from a farmer retiring nearby. Cattle hooves, it turned out, did less damage to wet ground than tractor tires ever could. On the true floodplain, the low wet acres that had drowned two families' corn crops, Elias planted flood-tolerant forage and put in shallow ponds where he raised a modest run of catfish and later added a small flock of ducks that thrived exactly where row crops had always failed. He didn't try to drain the low ground completely. He built shallow channels to manage where the water sat, instead of fighting to remove it all. Controlled drainage, not total drainage. From the county road, the farm looked strange. Patchy. Different sections doing different things in the same season, no two fields matching. The extension agent who came out that second summer walked the property with his hands in his pockets, shaking his head slowly. "You'd get more out of this if you'd just level it, tile it, plant it uniform," he said. "That's how everybody around here does it." Elias nodded, didn't argue, and kept writing numbers in his notebook. Neighboring farmers driving past started calling it Reed's patchwork, not always kindly. Some assumed he was improvising because he couldn't afford to farm the place properly, planting whatever he could scrape together, field by field, out of necessity rather than design. Elias let them think what they wanted. He was busy measuring. Erosion along the creek bank slowed. Once grass roots on the transition ground held the soil the way bare row crop never had. The high ground trees needed almost no irrigation, their roots already deep enough to find moisture on their own. Lost planting days dropped because Elias wasn't waiting on one single window across all 67 acres. When the high ground was too wet, the low ground ponds were already producing, and when the floodplain was underwater, the ridge was dry enough to work. Multiple harvest windows meant multiple paydays instead of one all-or-nothing gamble each fall. But those first 2 years stayed hard. Trees don't bear in year one. Cattle take time to build a herd worth selling. Fish ponds take a full season before there's anything to harvest. Elias kept the rented house with the leaking porch roof. He kept driving an old truck with a cracked windshield. He wasn't getting rich. He was building something, slowly, acre by different acre, the way he used to build a roadbed, one layer at a time, each one doing its own job. Then came the summer of the third year. The drought arrived in June and didn't let go until September. Rainfall across the county came in at less than half of normal for the season, month after month, the kind of dry stretch old-timers compared to the worst years anybody could remember. Creeks that usually ran full by July shrank down to a trickle of warm water over cracked stone. Farms across the valley that had spent decades draining their low ground as fast and as completely as they could started showing stress by mid-July. Corn leaves curled at midday, pastures burned brown and stopped growing. Wells that had never run dry started running dry. On Elias's farm, something different was happening underground. Years of holding water in the floodplain, instead of rushing it off the property, had recharged the soil far below the surface. The transition band, thick with deep-rooted forage grass, was pulling moisture up from levels the neighboring fields had drained away years before. The trees on the ridge, established now, barely slowed down. The low ponds, shrinking but still holding water, kept the ducks and catfish going through the worst of it. None of it was perfect. Some of the upper forage did brown out under the relentless sun. A few of the younger walnut trees needed hand watering to make it through August. But where neighboring conventional fields were losing 40–50% of their corn yield to the drought, Elias's diversified acres kept producing, section by section, the way they'd been designed to. The banker, who once called the place a pond that occasionally dries out, drove out that August, tires kicking up dust on a road that hadn't seen real rain in 10 weeks. He wasn't there to explain why the land wouldn't work this time. He stood at the edge of the transition pasture, green grass under his boots, while the field across the road stood brown and cracked, and he just asked how. The extension agent came back too, notebook of his own in hand this time, walking the property slower than he had 2 years before, asking real questions instead of shaking his head. Other farmers started showing up on Saturday mornings, uninvited, walking the fence lines, asking about the levee, the drainage channels, the mix of trees and grass and water. Elias walked them through it the same way every time. Not the whole ground at once, every acre doing what that acre was built to do. By the end of that 3rd year, the numbers told their own story. Elias had paid $26,000 for 67 flooded acres nobody else wanted. His first 2 years had run at a loss, same as anybody starting from Bottomland with a busted tractor bill in the mix. But by year 3, with trees bearing their first real crop, cattle sold at good weight off forage that never burned out, and fish and duck sales steady all summer, even as the drought squeezed everyone else, his net income per acre came in higher than any comparable small farm in the valley. Not because he had more land, he had less when you accounted for water on the low end most seasons. He was profitable because almost none of his 67 acres sat idle, and none of it depended on a single crop, surviving a single kind of weather. Neighboring row crop farms that year, hit hard by the drought, saw corn yields drop by nearly half, some worse, and profit per acre fell with it, in some cases into the red. Elias's farm, patchy and strange from the road, ended that drought year as the most profitable operation, acre for acre, in the whole valley. Late that September, with the drought finally breaking under the first real rain in months, Elias drove up to the same stretch of county road where he'd stood 3 years before, watching floodwater cross a field nobody wanted. He parked, same as always, one boot up on the guardrail. Below him, farmers were walking his land, taking their own notes now, measuring their own subtle rises and low corners, seeing the ground the way he'd taught himself to see it. He didn't say much to any of them that day. He didn't need to. The land was already saying it for him. The water was never the flaw. Treating every acre the same was.